I'm Sue Kaufman, and I'm the manager of the Houston Public Library Family History Research Center at the Clayton campus. And our guest today is both the director of the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the chief genealogical the chief genealogical officer at FamilySearch. And his name is David Rencher. And David is employed, as I mentioned, as the director of the Family History Library and the chief genealogical officer for FamilySearch. David graduated from Brigham Young University in 1980 with a BA in Family and Local History. He's been a professional genealogist since 1977, and he's one of the rare few that have earned both credentials: accredited genealogist with ICAP Gen in Ireland Research in 1981, and a certified genealogist with the Board for Certification of Genealogists in 2006. He serves as the Irish course coordinator and instructor for the Institute of Genealogical and Historical Research, the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh, and the British Institute. David's past president of the Federation of Genealogical Societies and the Utah Genealogical Association. He's a fellow of the Utah Genealogical Association and the Irish Genealogical Research Society in London. He serves as a director on the board of the National Genealogical Society, and David is also the winner of the P. William Philby Award from the National Genealogical Society and ProQuest for outstanding lifetime contributions to the genealogical community. David, I will stop sharing my screen.
I'm thrilled to be here. What a treat for me. Any day I can set my day job aside for a little bit and talk Irish genealogy. It's just a really, really good day. So I'm thrilled to be with you today. I'm thrilled to talk about Irish immigration. I know there are a lot of people that are challenged trying to identify their immigrants, and I hope that we can share a few tips for you today. There are a number of things that you may not have asked yourself about your Irish immigrant, and so I hope as I try to illuminate some of those for you today that we have the opportunity to look at those in some detail and see if we can understand why do people decide to pick up and move somewhere? Perhaps you've made a significant change in your life that you decided to, you were living in one place and you picked up and you moved halfway or clear across the country. Well, what prompts people to do that? I like to start with the data you already have. So analyze your data and have all the relevant home sources and family traditions been exhausted. Sometimes you have a clue at home that you don't even know you have, or another family member has a clue that is going to help answer the problem and you don't know they have it. And so we'll show you some examples of some of those today and look at that. Every time you take a seminar or a class or something, your knowledge goes up. And so you may have examined documents that you have in your possession, but you haven't gone back and re-looked at them now with your new knowledge and a different perspective of looking at those. And so it's always useful to pull out those documents and look at them again and say, what else can I possibly glean out of these things? When we all start out in research, I'll just say, I don't know of anybody who's ever started out doing it correctly. And so there's nothing to apologize there for. It's just we learn as we go. And so, for example, when you first started out, did you collect the names of the witnesses or the neighbors and the others with whom the ancestor may have been interacting at that time during their life? Odds are a big no, right? Because we didn't do it. It was like those names aren't related. They aren't the same surname. That isn't data I need. And yet for solving some of these really challenging problems, sometimes that is the very answer to what we need. Did you establish the relationship to the witnesses, the neighbors, and the others? If you will think about any major family event or any major document that may have been signed as part of your estate or something like that, are the witnesses family members or others with whom you have a close association? If you think about going to um, a religious event, some sacrament of that religion, or something that basically says, okay, this is when we get everybody together, and this is when the family gathers, right? The people that are in that circle, in that inner circle with you, are generally people that you know and have a relationship to, and they're the ones that come. So even things like the personals column in a newspaper, where so and so was here visiting for a funeral or something of that nature, are those names important to us for what we're looking at? Did you research the families of the witnesses and the neighbors to determine their place of origin? In many respects, families migrated together as groups of families. And so, sometimes it's only two families, but the records may be really good for the other family that was traveling with yours and not as good for your family. So if we can find where the other family is from, then the records in Ireland may support that link by identifying your family in those records, whereas the records in North America didn't do as good a job identifying that. Did you investigate the history of the time period in which they immigrated on both sides of the Atlantic? We're going to take a glimpse at that today, because everything has cause and effect, right? Something either pulled or pushed your people to America. It was one of those two things, right? There literally are no other answers. Something happened to precipitate that move. So the donkey moves because of the carrot before, and the stick behind. And that's what I'm saying about this movement. Something either enticed them to come to North America, or something pushed them to come to America. One of those two things happened. So in that immigration, in that push versus pull, do you understand what pushed or pulled them to the area in which they settled? Was it a multiple migration path? Did they land in a certain place to begin with and then migrate from there? Odds are heavily that either they migrated or their children migrated from that original settling point. What was going on in their life? Study the social history of the time, particularly anything around religious history or what's going on there. Study the political history. Are they literally running from something? Are they trying to escape some type of situation, and therefore they are motivated to leave a specific area? If you want a really good history on this for the Scotch-Irish view, James Layburn's book on social history of the Scotch-Irish does an excellent job of laying that out. So here are some factors that would push someone to immigrate. It might have been religious oppression. The penal laws in Ireland were established and implemented to try and force the Catholic population to become Protestant. And as they continued to impose more and more and more of the penal laws, those who could afford to migrate simply said, I've had enough, I'm leaving. They've heard about religious freedom in America. They've heard that they're not going to have to suffer under the same kinds of laws, and so they leave. In some instances, a depressed economy can force someone out. Things aren't turning around, and they do it. We see cycles of depressed economies where during our lifetime and where we live. And so again, those same kinds of things are going on for them. Remember that Ireland was an agrarian culture. There was a seasonality of work. And so you had the growing season, and then you had winter months. You had people who would migrate. So it was not uncommon for people, the men particularly in Ireland, during the growing season, during the spring through the summer and through the harvest in the fall, to work their plots of land or a landowner's piece of land in Ireland, but in the winter months go to England and work there. And so you had this constant movement back and forth. Did famine or disease push them out? We all generally know about what is termed the Great Famine of the 1840s, but this was a series of famines. It just happened to be worse than the previous ones. So all through the early 19th century, there were a series of famines. They were regional to a specific area. And even in the 18th century, again, you had as many as 400,000 people dying from famine in some of those early times. It wasn't close to the 2 million that died in the mid 19th century. And so that's why the other one is termed the Great Famine, because in proportion, it was so much worse than what had happened earlier. Laws of primogeniture, which has to do with land inheritance. Again, under the penal laws, if you were Catholic and your descendants were to inherit land, Catholic land had to be equally divided amongst all the heirs. But Protestant lands, the bulk of the estate could go to the oldest male heir. This quickly decimated the large Catholic landed estates. And so if these sons were receiving a very small portion in their inheritance, sometimes they would take and go to America, because here we were promising them tracts of land and other things for military service or something of that nature. Did somebody desert from the military, meaning they needed to get out of the country to not be pressed back into service? Were they convicted felons, or had they committed crimes? And sometimes they escaped for that reason. They were running from the law. Political unrest was throughout the 18th, 19th century. The 1798 rebellion was an impetus for some to come. So understanding the earliest date of on any record that your immigrant is in North America, that what is the earliest documented proof that you have that they were here. Use that document and start looking at what is going on in the political, economic, social, religious history of the time that may have been the impetus for them to move. There were in a depressed economy, actually landlords, poor law unions, orphanages, doing the math. It was simply less expensive to pay your passage and send you somewhere than it was going to be to continue to pay to sustain your life. And so immigration became a solution for what to do with these groups of people that they didn't know how else to take care of. Now, the flip side of this is what's pulling them to America and pulling them to immigrate. First and foremost among that are other family members, associates, or neighbors who have already arrived here. They're writing home. They're telling them that there are jobs here. There's land here. There's religious freedom here. They're painting a very good picture of what life is like in America, and they're writing back to their friends and saying, please get out from under the oppression that you are currently suffering and come here. You can make a good living here. In some instances, the minister will stand up in a congregation in Ireland and he will announce, I'm going to America, who would like to come with me? In other instances, ministers were being enticed and solicited to come because as the frontier continued to creep westward, ministers were in high demand. And your particular ancestor may simply have changed religions because that was the only church in the area at the time. And so you have to keep an open mind as to what religion they were here versus what religion they may have been in Ireland. There was plenty of land to purchase. There were advertisements in the Irish newspapers. North Carolina, for example, granting 40,000 acres if people would come and settle those lands. Those land grants with the promise for improvements to the land, all of that was going on. This was the talk on the street in Ireland of why you would come. Military service as a means to obtain those land grants was not uncommon. In some instances, people would get a land grant through the military. They would turn right around and sell it. So they never actually lived on the land. Rather, they sold it to take the money and move elsewhere. Jobs, particularly railroad, canal building, mining, coal mines, gold mines, hard rock mining versus soft rock. All of those things were bringing them. And of course, we all know about the gold rush, this belief that you can go to America and become wealthy. So in some instances, they landed on the East Coast and made a beeline for the West Coast as part of that. Then there was just the social aspect of just the promise of a completely better life and social situation and the freedom. There were other things that were specific to where they were living in Ireland that were so oppressive that to get out from under that, they would do anything if they could, if they had the means to be able to migrate. Religious freedom or a new religion. They've joined a new religious sect and they now come to North America. And then there are just the adventurers, people who just simply wanted to be on the frontier. They're hearing stories. There's still undiscovered places, right? I can go somewhere and I can see things for the first time that no one else has seen, before. There's that. In some instances, it was a marriage proposal, right? You had, for example, in some of the mining camps and some of these other areas where there just weren't that many women. And so they were writing back and enticing women to come over and marry. And then lastly, children don't always have a choice. If the parents decide to immigrate, the children just get pulled along, right? So, if you've got children ages 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, and 3, right? They come because the parents immigrate. And so one of those kinds of things could be happening. And so when you look at your immigrant ancestor, and let's say the first census you find them in is the 1850 census, and your immigrant ancestor is 3 years old, you pretty much have answered the question of how they got here. It's because they were pulled. But their parents are also your immigrant ancestors, and you've got to answer the question of why did they come? The other thing that you may not be as aware of is that there was this push out of Scotland to Northern Ireland. This primarily relates to the Scots-Irish. Life in Scotland in the 17th century was very hard and very poor for most of the population. The estimates place that 30,000 able-bodied Scots living in Ulster after the first 30 years of colonization there. The way they colonized Northern Ireland was to extend and grant lands to the Scottish landlords. So the Scottish landlords already had large landed estates in Scotland, and now they were being given in Ireland. People were on those lands with a lease. When the lease expired, these landowners would say, I'm granting you a new lease for land, but guess what? Your lease is on my Irish estate, not on my Scottish estate. And so they literally were picking them up then, and to help populate Northern Ireland, they were transferring them now off of their estate in Scotland to their estate in Northern Ireland. The few, which was a new form of land tenure, was introduced into Scotland prior to 1610, dispossessing many farmers off their traditional lands. It was a form of land enclosure. It led to a number of people being displaced and being replaced with people who could pay additional rent. Sir David Lindsay of the Mount lamented the fact that the tenure of fewing encouraged the dispossession of smaller tenants by those who were able to pay more. And so it wasn't really the humane or the moral thing to do. It was all about the money, right? I can displace you off my land and I can get more rent because this other tenant can pay me more than you're paying me. By 1610, when the plantation of Ulster was announced, many Scots felt not only the stick of poverty and lawlessness and insecurity, there was now the loss of status. And so this feeling that they had somehow been reduced in status was a big factor in their social aspect and standing in the community. Economic distress in the lowlands was predominant. was the predominant cause of migration during the first 50 years after the plantation scheme began in 1610. Those coming out of Scotland into Northern Ireland predominantly came from the Scottish lowlands, not the highlands. So after you get your people out of North America into Ireland, and you're trying to get them into Scotland, you're looking at the lowlands, not the highlands. From 1660 to 1690, religious difficulties were the chief incentive to migrate to Northern Ireland. Charles II, in 1660, ignored his pledges to the Scots to uphold the Solemn League and the Covenant that was signed in 1643. This was a pledge to the mutual defense against all enemies to root out prelacy, popery, superstition, and profaneness. This led to what was called the Killing Times. Covenanters of the Western Lowlands fought their guerrilla warfare against Charles's men, refusing episcopacy. Now, these same tactics continued clear up into the 20th century and now into the 21st century. This guerrilla warfare that has been fought in Ireland for many, many, many years. Many of these people were killed on the moors. Hundreds were cast into prison. Others were tortured, some hanged, martyrs for the Scottish Kirk. So think about all of this going on around you and now hearing that there's a better life in America. So when we look at the Scottish lowlands, we're looking predominantly at this area in red. So when you think about that, the other thing to think about is that people tended, when they migrated, to come from, tended to go to an area like an area they came from, because they knew how to cultivate, how to grow crops, how to deal with the weather. They often went in what is called that climate belt, if you will, there. So pulled from Scotland to Northern Ireland, the announcement of the plantation of Ulster in 1610 fueled the Scottish readiness to go abroad and seek one's fortune, stimulated by the planters. I was in Naval Reserve, and one of the things that the pilots in the Navy practiced were what we call touch and goes, which means that they would come in for a landing, they would touch down, and then they would immediately accelerate and take back off again. We had people practicing that coming out of Scotland, and that's why I'm mentioning it here in this presentation, because we had people that literally would come out of Scotland, touch down in Northern Ireland, and then come immediately on to America. The challenge that that creates is they do not leave a very big footprint in the recorded record set for Ireland. So just beware that your people may have done that as you're looking for them. Easy terms were offered to acquire a holding of land, reputed to be far more fertile and productive. Northern Ireland was the most fertile part of all of Ireland, and so those lands were very good. The native Irish were to be driven back into the hills or expelled, and the English army would provide protection, a promise of peace and law. So the very fertile lands in the north of Ireland were confiscated. The Catholics were sent to the western province of Camot, and they were displaced off those lands. So those beautiful rock walls that you see in the Irish calendars, those rocks came out of the middle of the fields, and that's what they were looking at. There's even a book written, To Hell or Connaught, the Cromwellian colonization from 1652 to 1660. And that literally is talking about the displacement of these people in Northern Ireland out to the western province of Connaught. The religious turmoil throughout the 1660s and 1670s is raging in Scotland. It culminates with the Covenanters being decisively defeated at Bothwell Bridge in 1679. And it was compared to the freedom of worship in nearby Ulster. Many ministers migrated to Ulster and their congregations followed out of Scotland. So you've got this large migration. Now remember that this is setting up a pattern of migrating with the minister. And so when these ministers decided to come to America, this pattern in the mindset of those was already established. I'm going to stick with the minister and I'm going to go on to America. The 1707 Act of Union between Scotland and England brought immediate economic improvement to the lowlands. And then the push and pull of the Scots toward Ireland practically ceased when the Stuarts no longer sat on the throne. So this is Northern Ireland, these 6 counties. But when somebody refers to the north of Ireland, they also include the 3 counties of the Republic. Now, the push from Northern Ireland to America, again, the same principle of the carrot and the stick exists. The native Irish who'd been pushed from their lands were living in the hills and fighting this guerrilla warfare that I talked about previously. They were known as woodkerns or woodcairns. And so they were continually on a daily basis attacking the settlers and taking their food, disrupting, doing anything they could. They operated in bands. They were a constant threat to the Scottish and the English settlers. They lived by plunder. The government offered large sums for their heads, and the colonists were ferocious in dealing with any who were caught. But this was constantly going on. Now think about that. They come to America, and what are they dealing with in America that's practically similar to what they were dealing with in Northern Ireland? They're dealing with Native Americans who are doing some of the same things. And so this pattern is interesting as you look at the similarities and you draw the similarities between life in Northern Ireland and life in America. Here's one you probably have not even thought of. Wolves were a constant threat. Much of Northern Ireland was heavily wooded, and pastures near the forest were never safe. So think about letting your kids play outside and that kind of thing. It wasn't safe. Think about this. In 1652, a bounty of £6, an enormous sum, was offered by Cromwell's government for the head of every she-wolf. I have had somebody ask me if they only had the head, how did they know it was a she-wolf? I do not have an answer for you, so you can ask that in the chat, but I don't know the answer. The bounty continued until 1710, and wolves were not eliminated from Ireland until 1770. Thomas Wentworth imposed a ban on the selling of Irish linen since it competed with English linen accomplished by the Woolens Act of 1699. So here's a complete contradiction. On the one hand, they've been promoting them to and giving them incentives to grow flax and to produce linen, and then they turn right around and impose a ban on the very thing that they've been promoting them to do. So the government decisions just went back and forth. This is a huge one. Rack renting by absentee landlords turned previously prosperous Scottish farmers into poverty. And rack renting, again, was this instance of getting renters who could pay more and kicking them off their lands. Whole villages lost their Protestant element to immigration. Literally, everybody who was Protestant within the boundaries of the civil parish decided to go with the minister to America. From 1714 to 1719, you saw 6 consecutive years of drought. So if your first record of somebody in America is during that time period, it may be the drought that pushed them, right? Flaxseed was scarce. It was limiting the linen production, which meant that they couldn't earn a living in the off months. So drought was impacting their ability to raise crops in an agrarian culture in the growing season. And the limitations of that meant that they then didn't have the flax to turn into linen for their cottage industry that they had for the winter months. The last major underpinning was religious persecution. It was announced that children of all Protestants not married by the rights of the established church, which was the Church of Ireland, which was equivalent to the Church of England, should be regarded as bastards, and many persons of undoubted reputation were prosecuted in the bishops' courts as fornicators for cohabitating with their own wives. Think about these people being very religious and now being accused of this. It did not sit well. It wouldn't sit well with any of us who, feel like we are legally married, and now to be accused of this was just downright insulting. All right, coming to America. There were 5 major waves of Protestant immigration. The first one coming at that very early time period based on the drought and rack renting. So from 1717 to 1718. The second wave, also impacted by rack renting and poverty in 1725, 1729. You reach a point at which you only have enough economic resources to be able to immigrate. You know that if you stay and your resources drop below a certain line, that immigration is not going to be an option to you. And so you have to make a very difficult decision that you are now going to immigrate. From 1740 to 1741, you have the beginning of a series of famines. Like I said, 400,000 people die during these years between 1740 and 1741. This was a major wave of immigration and a major impetus for immigration during that time period. 1754 to 55, you have effective propaganda from America and severe drought in Ulster. The two combined were the push and the pull. So they were enticing them to come to America, and the drought was literally pushing them out of Ulster. From 1771 to 75, you had evictions followed by the expiration of leases of some of the largest landowners. The Marquis of Donegal in County Antrim, the rents were greatly increased. 30,000 people leave Ulster. Now think about the descendants from those 30,000 today. And so perhaps this is your family that is here from there. So when we look at the search, we want to systematically examine all of the records for known family members, right? We want to know and understand whether or not they came alone. And too frequently, we immediately leap to the conclusion that, oh, they came alone because I don't see anybody else in that immediate area with the same surname. Be sure to include all variants in spelling. Remember that frequently the spelling of the surname is not a matter of how your ancestor spelled their name. Rather, it's a matter of how the clerk spelled your ancestor's name when they recorded it. In the English language, phonetically, all vowels are interchangeable. So when I search for my surname, Rencher, I search for Rancher. I even go so far as to replace the N in my name with a U because it can sometimes be misread. So Reucher is not uncommon in my search strategies. Keep a very open mind about what's going on with that. Sometimes we need to look at the neighbors and the associates in a specific area, and we literally need to reconstitute the small area of the small population of people immediately around our families and reconstitute that neighborhood if necessary. If you're looking at a group of 20 families and 6 of those families all came from the same place in Ireland, you should probably be paying a lot of attention to that place for your family if a record isn't pointing you specifically there. Piece the family together with the documented evidence. I don't know about you, but I'm a fan of CSI shows because I learned so much about how to do genealogy by watching the people do this, the CSI detective work, right? So what do? They get a blank whiteboard. They start putting the suspects up on the board, which is exactly what I do with my candidates for parentage or for immigration or that type of thing. And then I begin out of the historical record set or the DNA or something to pull the pieces of evidence and assign them to one of those people. I will reach a point at which I can eliminate them and I can say, okay, this cannot be my guy for these reasons, right? And I put the big X through him and I move on to my other 5 candidates. It's exactly the same way with what you're trying to do with your research. So this is a really good example of a tombstone that has several key pieces of data on it. This is the Manny family. You'll notice William, and you have his dates of birth and death and his wife. You then have William and Jane near Manny, and it gives us an exact place in Ireland where they're from, Siskinor, Tillivally in County Tyrone in Ireland. And then it lists sons of Jane Manny, Daniel, who dies in Vickers, Quebec, William and Robert, and lastly, Hugh, who dies in Half Day, Illinois. So my question to you is, where is this tombstone located? If we were in a class together and I could see hands go up. Some of you would likely say, well, it must be in Half Day, Illinois, or it must be in Quebec, or you might pick some other place. And so what we do know is that these people are associated in a family relationship together, all listed on one tombstone. So where is it located? That tombstone is in Middlebury Cemetery in Middlebury, Addison County, Vermont. And all of that information that I've just shared with you is here on the back of this tombstone. So what about Hugh that dies out in Half Day, Illinois? If he's your guy and you suddenly say he came to America by himself, it's not true. He had many family members in America. The rest of the family members just weren't in Half Day, Illinois. And so finding out where he was before he was in Illinois becomes a key strategy to you in methodology for identifying the place that your family is from. All right. Let's look at some methodologies of how to solve various problems. Every situation is different. Every problem I pick up is different. There are just like when you're building something, right? There are times when you're reaching your toolkit and you use this tool because that's the tool that's needed to solve that specific problem. And there are times when you don't use that tool at all because there's another tool in the toolkit that does it. That same analogy applies here. And so we are looking at ways to do that. Some of these, I always get people who want to jump immediately to kind of this shot in the dark approach. So I'm going to share with you the shot in the dark approach, but I'm going to say to you ahead of time, I hope that what you have done is exhausted all of the records in a specific area, looked at all of the friends and the associates and the neighbors, and looked at the causes and understanding what's going on in the area, so that you understand a lot about these people. One of the things that we need the most in solving an immigration problem is we need unique identifiers about that person and why they're there. And so if I'm going to pick one Mary Murphy out of a pile of Mary Murphys in Ireland, I have to know some other things about her. All right. But look at this. So I was once working on a problem where I knew that a man with the surname Hanley had married a woman with the surname Farrell. Now, you may have found that, for example, found two surnames like that off of a US death certificate. And you know from the census that they got married in Ireland, but you're not finding them necessarily in other records. I happen to know from an English census, this couple went to England. They were enumerated in the census there, and in birthplace there, it said they were from County Roscommon. Well, there are 59 parishes, civil parishes in the county of Roscommon. So I could start looking at all of the registers at that time, but which ones, right? How do I find them? Well, there are a number of different surname locating tools that kind of tell you where the surnames are. When we have two surnames like this, we're actually going to leverage the power of those two surnames. Why? Because the people with those two surnames have to be in the same place to get married, right? And so if I can identify all of the parishes in County Roscommon where those two surnames appear, I can begin a strategic search for them in other records. For the earlier time period, some of you who are dealing with perhaps Scots-Irish, the tithe records can cover the time period from 1780 to 1840. Okay, this is a key point. If I were giving an exam at the end of this session, this is a foot stomping key point. And this is difficult to understand, but your ancestor, the person you're looking for, does not have to be in these records, because what we are looking at is the probability of the distribution of surnames in that area, that there are going to be others named that may not be in this record. So for example, let's say that your person came to America in 1830. you would still use the Griffith valuation because of the stability of the surnames in Ireland still show us where that surname is located in those parishes. For the very early time period, some of you who are dealing with those first waves of immigration, the religious censuses from 1720 to 1780 are helpful, and then even earlier, the hearth money rolls. Again, these are 4 very broad surname locating tools for these early time periods. Grenham's Irish Surnames is online, and you can look at it and look at the distribution. So, for example, if I go in and I look for the surname Shea, you will see that it is predominantly a Southern Ireland name with a particularly heavy emphasis on County Cork and County Kerry. And so all of these dots, you can do a free search on that website and you can look at those, and that's in your handout that's provided. So research steps, you'd want to make a list of the parishes where Hanley is found, right? The first surname. Then you'd want to make a list of the parishes where the second surname is found. You can do that very easily on Grenham's online list because he will pull those together for you. His list is based on the Griffith valuation, which was the first one I showed you. Then you could simply prioritize the list based on the numbers that you found there. So you could start with the largest numbers and you could work further down. Or you could identify the population for the parishes and divide that number and then rank them based on the highest statistical probability. Now, I know that research skills and everything else are on a broad spectrum, right? You do not have to do this step. Those of you who feel comfortable doing that step, I'm going to very quickly just kind of show you the methodology for that. I'm not going to go deep into the math. This is a technique that we refer to as probabilistic record linkage. It's used by governments, by all kinds of entities where they are trying to uniquely identify people in automated databases, and they are scoring them with a specific threshold to see if the 2 entries match. At that point, though, whether you include step 4 or skip step 4, the next thing now that you do is you search for other records in that specific area that are going to pull your people out. So the British Parliamentary Papers give you immigration statistics. So this would be if you do choose to do step 4. Like I say, I'm going to quickly run through this. When you go in there and you look at the population statistics, it will tell you, for example, what the population was in each of these baronies for from the 1851 census and from the 1841 census. So you would take that number and you would simply divide it. So here are the parishes. Here's the population of 41, the population in 51, and you would simply look at surname 1 and surname 2. All right, you are going to have a gray area that's in between. So let me explain it this way. Let's say that you wanted to arrest all of the criminals within a given population. So let's just pick a city. Let's pick Dayton, Ohio, right? Let's say that you wanted to arrest every criminal in Dayton. There are 2 ways you could do this. If you set the gray area clear over to the right, then you would absolutely arrest every criminal. But in the process, you would also arrest quite a few innocent people because you were going for the maximum. If you set the threshold all the way over to the left, you would make sure that you had only arrested criminals, but you would let a few criminals go so that you didn't arrest anybody who was innocent. And that's kind of what we're doing in this record linkage technique, is we're setting that gray area. So I'm not going to go into depth in this. I'm just going to show you there is math behind the whole science and that it does work really well. So you take the number of occurrences divided by the population number. So in Grenham's tool, he will tell you that there were, for example, 16 people of this surname in this parish. Your number of occurrences is 16. You would take the population of the parish and you would divide 16 by the population of the parish, and you would end up with a number, right? In this instance, I've used the number 4. I've divided it by the population of 28,954, and I've come up with the mathematical figure for that. Now, here's the technique of leveraging the two surnames. Once you've done that for surname 1 and for surname 2, so we've done it for Hanley, we've done it for Farrell, we multiply those numbers, and that gives us our ranking for the parishes. So we've got the 59 parishes in County Roscommon. We've gone through, we've identified the parishes that have the surname Hanley and the surname Farrell. I'm keeping it at the barony level for now, just for the purposes of an example, but then I begin to look at the rankings. So this is only the surname Hanley at this point. So if I just look at this and I just look at the occurrences, I can see that in the barony of Ballintober North, there are 62 occurrences there of that surname. I can see that the next highest one is Ballintober South and the next one is Roscommon. So I could start a search that way. I could start looking in the other records in those three baronies, and that would work just fine. You'd look at the ones in the parishes and you would just work your way down. If I look at the surname Farrell, for example, I see that there are 46 entries in Roscommon, 36 in Boyle, 45 in Ballintober South. But my highest with the surname Hanley was in the other one was Ballintober North. Notice that it ranks 4th in this list, right? So if I take the two and I rank them, then I get the order in which I would begin to search the baronies. So in this instance, if I take the two and I multiply them and I get the ranking, then I get Ballintober North comes up as my number 1. French Park, that I didn't even mention before, actually comes up as number 2. So all I'm playing here are the statistical odds of a Hanley marrying a Farrell. Okay, that's what I'm doing. So when you look at those, that's how it shakes out. So this is kind of a comparison. If I'm just looking straight at the numbers for Hanley and Farrell, and I'm looking at the statistical rank, you'll notice that number 1 for Farrell was Roscommon. The number 1 for Hanley was Ballintober North. The combined number 1 for both of them is Ballintober North, even though it ranked 4th for the Farrells. Number 2 is French Park, even though it ranked 4th for Hanley and 7th for Farrell. Statistically, the statistical probability, it's number 2. Ballintober South ranked 2 for both Hanley and for Farrell, but statistically ranks number 3. So you can see the power of the technique that way. So we're just going to look at that and then look at the statistical rank, and you can kind of get a feel for how that all shakes out. All right, another technique that is widely used these days is DNA. DNA is one of the brightest tools in our toolkit that we've had. I'm sure that many of you have had your DNA test. I'm sure that it shows ethnicity to Ireland, and so you are looking at that. I'm going to show you an example here just from a problem that I worked on. This one happened to be for Thomas Farr of Bedford, England. And these were the DNA results, and it pulled all of those together. So when we started looking at this problem, we had documented evidence that Stephen Farr Jr. was a child of Stephen Farr. But when we looked for other children of Stephen, we couldn't find any documented evidence for him. What we finally found was a note in the margin of the vital records for the community where they were living, where the enumerator of vital records said, "I quit." And he said, "I've got people that will not register their children." And then he started naming names, and the Farrs were at the top of the list of the families that would not register their children. But when we did the DNA, we began to see that the participants matched of these other descendants. And so we were able to establish this link to them in America and pull together the family group of whom we believed were Stephen Farr's children. When we worked that back, we were actually able to look at a Thomas Farr entry that looked really good to be the father of Stephen. And what we found was that when we matched those descendants, those participants, Again, it matched on the DNA. Tracing descendants. If you are just tracing your ancestors, in 7 generations, you've got 127 people. But if you're tracing descendants, you've got almost 11,000 on average in that same amount of time. So a whole different view of what you're doing. Remember that with DNA, you are tracing descendants. How you organize your research. I love this organization just simply because this gentleman started out with a biography of his immigrant ancestor. Then he looked at the ancestry of them. Then he looked at the descendants, the first 5 generations, and then he looked at the later generations as well. So you don't simply reverse the process. So it's where did my ancestor come from versus where did his or her descendants go? Tracing historical migration trails to the point of entry, or looking for evidence of social, economic, and cultural drivers for where they may have gone. Who generally gets the genealogical family memorabilia in a family? The oldest daughter is more likely to have one-of-a-kind items, church removal certificates, ancestral overseas letters, engraved silver, those kinds of things. It's not uncommon for the daughter to have those in their possession. They may have photographs or etchings that are unique to that family. So artifacts, military buttons and medals. We had somebody bring a military button into the family history library one day and say, is there anything genealogically I can do with that? We were delighted to see it because military buttons were unique to a specific regiment in the English military. And so when we saw the button and we were able to identify the button with the regiment, we were then able to get into military records, which opened the whole problem up. Some of you have seen hair wreaths, which are practically a family group when they've identified who is on there and that type of thing. Family letters going back and forth. There are collections of family letters that are particularly useful. Communion tokens is something that you may not have, or something that you may have that's one of the artifacts in your home and you don't realize what it is. Communion tokens were little pewter or lead tokens. They were used to be able to partake of communion in the Presbyterian Church. They are identified with a mark on them, but they don't give you an actual name. But there's a guide to those that will actually convert it to what they are. And so you may have this little piece of metal in a jar somewhere that came from great grandma, and you don't know what it is, but it turns out to be a communion token. Family letters. This was one where a family Bible, I knew from this picture of these 2 little girls that there was another daughter in this family, but I couldn't identify who the other daughter was. And then I get this family Bible that came into my possession, and here's the answer. Mary Louisa Rencher departed this life in the city of Washington, D.C., where her father was serving in Congress on the 14th day of February, 1849 at 11 o'clock in the morning, and was buried in the Washington Cemetery, number 126 in Range M East. Quote, she was taken of scarlet fever February 8th, and at 11 o'clock on the 14th, her spirit passed away. The beautiful clay was carefully ornamented by the hands of a stranger, sweet, lovely child, farewell. And signed by her mother. And so obviously the next time I went to Washington, I made a beeline for this grave, and sure enough, there's the tombstone, and there it is. The entire rest of that family are all buried down in Pittsboro in Chatham County, North Carolina. But this one daughter that I could not find is up there. All right, the hair wreath that I mentioned earlier, look at this. You're looking at exact links, but you're also looking at practically a complete family group. What do marriages and divorces do to tracing female lines? They really complicate it. When searching for the marriage of a female daughter of a divorced mother, look under her birth name, look under her mother's maiden name, look under the surname of any of her mother's subsequent husbands. And so you never know what surname she may be carrying. Who generally gets the father's keepsakes? The youngest, the oldest, or only sons are more likely to have tools, military medals, uniforms, firearms, those kinds of things, but you never know what might be engraved or some clue on them. So strategies for you commonly used for tracing descendants and that. I've added this as a tip for searching for immigrants. You may not be aware that on the FamilySearch website, you can search by record type. So type in the person you're looking for. So I typed in here, Austin Shea, born in Ireland in 1828. And then down under add record options, you'll see type there in the middle. If you click on type, it will open up this box and you can actually click on immigration and naturalization. And now that means when you do a search, it's only going to bring back records dealing with immigration or naturalization. So you don't have to clutter the search with all of the census and the church records and everything else. You're only looking at immigration records when you click on that search box. And so here, for example, now are all of the results based on the search type for immigration. So make sure that you leverage every tool you possibly can. Strategies for funeral home records: ask for copies of the death certificates. The funeral home often retain those. Ask for copies of the obituary, the copies of the funeral card or the program, information on burial or cremation, particularly if they were transferred somewhere, contact information for the next of kin. There's a lot of information if the funeral home is willing to share it with you. Strategies for missing death certificates. The Vital Record Division doesn't have a copy of the certificate. That is a good indicator that the person died in another state. What they will have at a local funeral home is what's called a removal permit, which was filed with the local funeral home, which was the transfer of the remains from one funeral home to the other one. With that certificate, you now know which state they died in, and you can apply for the missing death certificate there. With cemetery records, the name and address of the plot owners, you want to know how big the plot is, how many graves did they actually purchase, because if there are different surnames occurring on the graves either side of the one you're looking for, they may still be related family members. It's one of the way of overcoming unlisted phone numbers. Phone books these days are completely worthless. It's a dynamic phone system. Everybody's got mobile phones. Those numbers aren't published. All of that type of thing. So record the neighboring graves in each direction and try to identify those that are related. So in conclusion, search for all of their contemporaries. Look at where they settle and look at the people immediately around them. If we can't find recorded evidence of where your ancestor came from, perhaps we can find recorded evidence of where those with whom they're associating came from, and it may be the same place. You're going to search for the descendants. Why? Because they have family artifacts and other things that may give you the clue to where your people came from. And then you're going to search all of the available sources for them because you're trying to reconstruct the picture of them. You often are also trying to differentiate between people of the same name, and it's those other sources that are going to be able to say, this John Hanley is different from this John Hanley. So just with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll see if we can answer some questions for you and go from there.
Great, David. Thank you so much. You can see my screen, just the type introductory slide, correct? I just want to make sure. So let's see. All right, David, it was an amazing amount of information. I think one of my biggest takeaways was one of the last words that you said was reconstruct. You know, you started the presentation with a huge amount of history, which we can't ignore the history because doing the history eliminates the mystery. And so the social history is so important. You know, that was the big, you know, why did they come? Why did they leave? And then rebuilding the family and the neighbors. You want to talk about the social history just a little for a second and rebuilding everything?
So first off, of course, you have an amazing resource there where I know that you have a lot of the kinds of histories that would help people rebuild that. But we probably tend to ignore, you know, we're trying to answer some challenging issues here of why, right? We're the very first question we're trying to answer is why? Why did the person end up where they did? And what were the causes for that? So when we're looking in the newspaper at the time, you know, what's happening? What's going on? And so as you try to reconstruct what's going on in the neighborhood, you know, what's there. Now, the other thing to remember about newspapers is that people were buying local newspapers not so much for news in their area as they were for news in other areas, because they knew the local news in their area. And so sometimes the local information about your area is actually in a newspaper that's 100 miles away, because the same thing, they're not reporting on local news in their area, they're reporting on what's happening in the other area, right? So you have to be very broad-minded when you use newspapers. But that reconstruction is extremely important to you.
And you also mentioned, I think a lot of us, when you talk about look at the documents that you have, when we collect a document, we're looking at a document for one reason, and going back to those documents is just as important, correct?
Correct. Absolutely. And again, just the learning, if I pick up some of the very first documents I ever captured in my genealogical research, well, what I know today and what I knew 40 years ago, there's no comparison, right?
Right. And then, of course, the analysis of everything, when you talked about, the shot in the dark, and I will say, if I knew the genealogy was going to bring in numbers, I might not have. It was a great thing to do, if you can grasp the statistics. That was interesting. Like remember the old census books that we had, and we would
I
use
do.
those opened up. Yeah, just to see where the names were
I
in
do.
the area. So same type of thing. Um, the idea of looking at that and really analyzing the documents and analyzing beyond really focusing on your one individual, I think is an important thing,
Right.
correct?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say, if you can come up with the NCAA odds with that prod, with the statistical, I would like to see that too. So and I
March
do
Madness.
appreciate go ahead. What were you going to say about the NCAA odds?
I just said March Madness.
There you go, March Madness. Yep. I appreciate the FamilySearch site, and bringing that up, of course, because there has been that redesign. So that hint at how to, which is a great redesign. So we appreciate that. Mitch, what kind of questions did we get in the chat?
We got several questions here. Um, I'll just tell you, David, you gave me a lot to think about, and a lot to go back and look at now.
Wonderful.
So let's see. We have a question from Monica. And just let me remind everybody, it's not too late to get your questions in. If you still have questions, we'll be monitoring the chat here. But Monica asks you to please repeat the name and author of the book mentioned earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, it was James Leyburn, Leyburn, and it was a Scots-Irish history. You'll see it in the bibliography in the handout,
Okay.
and so you should be able to find it there.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
Scots-Irish history.
Okay. So Deanne L says, asks, is there a way to get mining employee records to confirm a person was employed there? We have family reports, but no documentation. Do you have some information about maybe mining in Ireland?
What a great question. You're going to think I paid her to ask the question. For the first time, I've really been able to dig into Irish miners across America. And I'm actually giving that presentation in May at the National Genealogical Society's conference. But there's a long answer and a short answer. The short answer is yes, there are mining records to be found. The challenge is finding them, obviously. There are a number of mining maps and other things, but the mining records may still be with the mining companies. And so determining what the mining company was or where the mining claim is may be your biggest challenge. And then what type of miner were they? Were they a hard rock miner? Were they a coal miner? Were they, a placer miner? Whatever they're trying to do, right? And so the thing about miners, and this is all the things I talked about with friends, associates, and neighbors, with mining in particular, it is extremely important because we know that we have ties from miners as groups to specific areas of Ireland where the same type of mining was going on there. So you have people coming off the Beara Peninsula in the west of Ireland, in County Cork and Kerry, going to, for example, the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. And so those ties are very, very strong. And they were sending back and they were saying there are more mining jobs here. So yes, identifying those mining records at the local level and discovering who owned the mine, that's what you're going to have to dig into. But it's a wide open field to start exploring.
Could you clarify maybe the time period you're speaking about for these mines and maybe the areas of Ireland?
So the bulk of the mining is going on during the 19th century. I mean, there were very early mines. I mean, there was mining that goes all the way back into medieval times in Ireland. But when we're talking about records in that, we predominantly are talking about mining records that would have been created during the 19th century and leading up into the 20th century.
Okay. Were you talking about Southern Ireland though?
No, all over Ireland.
Over Ireland.
Yeah,
okay.
There were just different types of mines, right? There were bauxite, there was lead, there was gold, there were all types of mines, and that's why understanding if you have a mining ancestor, what type of mining did they do? Because there's a chance that they were trained or learned that skill, that mining skill in Ireland, and we can zero in on those areas and those mines in Ireland to possibly connect our people to areas.
Okay, right. Thank you. So, Mary Ellen says one immigrant ancestor arrived through Baltimore, Maryland. Their daughter was born in 1829 in the 6th Collection District of Baltimore. Mary Ellen asked, how would I find out what Catholic churches were around so they could obtain the birth certificate?
So they're probably not going to get a birth certificate per se as we think of it. The best they're going to hope for there is a baptismal record for a child in that area. There was a very good Research in the States guide just recently published for Maryland. The other place to go would be the FamilySearch Research Wiki under the search tab on the FamilySearch site. Go down to the wiki on that, and then type in Baltimore church records, for example, and it's very likely that we have a good list of the records divided out by religion. So couple of really good things. And Maryland has a marvelous state archives, by the way.
Okay. When you look at the Catholic and the Protestant divisions in Ireland,
right,
how was it common? Do you see intermarriage between those two faiths very often?
So there were always examples of intermarriage. If you ask me, was it common? I'm going to say no, it wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. And particularly after immigration. Again, you can't stop two people from falling in love. Only horror of horrors to their parents. They find out that one's Catholic and one's Protestant. But there were penalties. So, for example, in land inheritance, for example, if a Protestant marries a Catholic, unless the Catholic swears allegiance to the king, then the inheritance rights for that son are not there, right? The law of primogeniture is in effect because the Catholic spouse hasn't converted to Protestantism. So there were things where you just need to dig into the history and thoroughly understand what the motivations may have been and what the implications may have been of them doing that.
Okay. We have a question that's just came in from Christine. Ask if you could repeat the name of the website with the Irish surnames.
John Grenham, just Grenham. Just go to Google and type John Grenham surnames, and his site will come up.
Is that on your handout?
It should be in the handout as well.
Okay, great.
It's easy to Google.
Okay.
I have a friend that says Mr. Google knows everything.
Exactly. It may not know everything, but it knows where to find it.
Exactly.
Okay. That's all the questions that I have. I don't have anything else coming up in the chat, so I'd just like to thank you again, Mr. Rencher, and turn it over to Sue.
Thank you.
David, again, thank you. Thank you, Mitch. David, your handout is amazing. There are plenty of readings, plenty of ideas of where to search. And I know that we have on the last page where you have some of the, maybe not the last page, but a lot of the conference syllabus cited.
Right.
We have some of those at Clayton. Is there have they been digitized, some of the previous conference syllabus?
I'm not aware of them being
Yeah.
digitized, but one of the things we do have at the Family History Library is we do have a lookup service. So you can go to our library web pages and you can submit a request through the library lookup service. And we have most of those conference syllabi on the shelf here at the Family History Library.
Great, great. Because some of those articles, although, some of the dates, a lot of times when we do family history research, especially when we want to do citation analysis for further reading, let's ignore the date sometimes of publication of things, because you never know what you're going to find in some of those handouts, as in your handout, which is amazing. David, let's just a quick question about the National Genealogical Society Conference in May.
Right.
We know that some of it is on property and some of it is being recorded.
Right.
So, of course, registering for either one. Will your presentation on the minors, is that an on property only, or it will be recorded?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that one is on property only. So
Okay.
that one's an on site. They're not doing recordings of all of the presentations this year. I am recording one, but it's on my Arizona lecture, and so the Irish mining one isn't. It will be a session that I will be giving again later in other places. I just don't know where yet.
Well,
So you could watch
maybe,
for that.
Maybe expect an email from us, David.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go.
For those of you that aren't familiar with what we're talking about the National Genealogical Society Conference that is happening in May. David, dates in May?
I believe it's the 24th.
Yeah, later in the, yes, around there in the 20s, but
yeah, 25th through the 28th.
And the website is ngsgenealogy.org, correct?
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. An amazing amount of lectures that will be recorded, and just a wonderful way to get further education. David, thank you very much for
thank you.
your time and the effort of putting it together, and the amazing information that you gave us. And for all of us that are listening, watch the same way you registered for today's event through the Houston Public Library website or the Clayton Library Friends website to register for David's mining presentation, probably next year, because we're pretty booked out already to December. But by all means, we would love to have David back. And so for those of you that are interested in visiting us on property here, we have expanded hours. Pretty exciting. You can see our hours there. We were open till 4. Now we're open till 5. Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. And we brought nights back. So for those of you that were looking for nights, we're open on Thursday from 12 to 7. And David, would you like to go? Why not rattle off the family history library hours while we're at it, if you're ever in Salt Lake?
Right. So if you come visit us, we're open from 9 to 5, Monday through Saturday. We are going to move at some time before too long to our expanded hours, which it'll either be like 9 to 9 or 9 to 8 or something. So we'll be open in the evenings, and that's Monday through Saturday. So yeah, we'd love to have people visit here. We had 4 different genealogical societies from out of town, 4 groups here this week. So they've had a lot of fun.
That's right. Get a bunch of friends together and go on over to Salt Lake, because believe it or not, as with our location, there's stuff inside the buildings that is not anyplace else. That's right.
True story.
That's right. And your ancestors are waiting for you here at Clayton. They're waiting for you in Salt Lake at the Family History Library. And I'm sure that all of us would love to take a trip wherever, but by all means, David and I would love to see you. So I would like to thank all of us. And before we sign off today, thank everybody at HPL on this side who makes to work this presentation happen. Mitch and Joy and Justin. Thank all of you for joining us today. David, again, thank you so much. Everybody take care. treat everybody well, and remember, cite your sources, right? Thanks, everybody. David, thank you again. Thanks, everybody,
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Have a good weekend. Bye.